Well chaps, another 80th anniversary video of a Royal Navy, what is effectively, at its heart, a Royal Navy operation. The Second World War was in some respects the last gasp of the Royal Navy of old, or at least the Royal Navy of history anyway, all the way back to the days of Sir Francis Drake, and before that of course the era of the Merry Rose, and out through to the Napoleonic Wars, ripe for Hornblower and Jack Aubrey novels, up through forging of empire, where the Royal Navy ultimately had bases all over the world, virtually in every single continent it seemed but for Antarctica, and all the way into the First World War, where there was action, be it Jutland, the Falklands, even Gallipoli, and so on and so forth. By the 3rd of July 1940, the Royal Navy had been involved in some slightly glorious actions, you might say, at the time. The Admiral Graf Spee, the hunt and subsequent destruction, albeit by the German captain himself, in December 1939. The actions of the Altmark, at the Altmark incident, Dunkirk, Boulogne, and so on and so forth. On the 3rd of July 1940, a Royal Navy force under Admiral Somerville launched what remains, and probably always will remain, one of the greatest concentrations of naval barraging and naval firepower in history. The action only lasted a little over 5 or so minutes. It was a blinking you miss it. It was known as Operation Catapult. Involved were the infamous HMS Hood, infamous because of what, within a year, going down to the bottom of the ocean, Denmark Straits, with all but 3 of her crew having been sunk by the Prince Eugen in escort of the battleship Bismarck. Also present were the famous HMS Valiant, at least would become famous by the end, and I forget now, but I think it was a Valiant that slipped her moorings at Portsmouth Harbour as she was being towed to the scrapyard and rammed herself aground as if she didn't want to go. There was also HMS Resolution and the famous aircraft carrier Ark Royal, herself gone within a year, sunk by U-39. Also involved in this action were a succession of cruisers and destroyers, but this episode in the Royal Navy's history, this episode in Britain's history, is not a glorious one. I'm not seeking to be melodramatic, but not so. These videos have largely covered events, although horrible for those involved, have partially seen some sort of success or some kind of glory, and not in a dare-do for dear old Sirosh, as Ernie Pyle wrote during the Blitz. Just, the Royal Navy did some incredible effort during the evacuation of Boulogne, with many, captains and officers killed by sniper fire, and during Dunkirk when ships were sunk but damaged and risked, be it hunting the Graf Spee and risking life and limb, because the war at sea started on the day war was declared and was largely forgotten because the phony war was happening. And after, we had the hunt for the Bismarck, there was the Battle of Cape Matapan, the Battle of the North Cape, where the Scharnhorst was hunted to her death, and many other episodes, large and small, involving ships big and large. As far as I'm aware, the great author, Nicholas Monsarrat, who wrote The Cruel Sea, probably one of the best books I've ever read, it's not a war book, it is a story of men at war, but a story of humanity in a way. It's an incredible book. But as far as I'm aware, Mr. Monsarrat, himself a Royal Navy officer during the war, big and large ships, never really wrote about this event, certainly didn't put it into fiction, and I can't imagine that anyone concerned with it rejoiced. About 80 years ago today, and yesterday, the War Cabinet started to discuss what was to be done in the aftermath of the collapse of France, and amongst that chief concern was the French fleet. The French Navy might not have been utilised properly so far in the war, and was not going to now, unless the ships sailed into British ports effectively. But they had some impressive ships like the Britannia and the La Galicienne, I can never pronounce it, the La Galicienne class destroyers, my god. Is it any wonder that I didn't do too well at French? Battle cruisers, a couple of battleships, and they were scattered, but mostly at Mers-el-Kebir in Oran. The prospect of these ships falling into German hands, because now you had Vichy France, who were undeniably closer to Nazi Germany than they would have been Britain, was unthinkable to everyone, including Winston Churchill. Now, for all of the faults in this book, Boris Johnson's Churchill factor at least acknowledges that, like a bulldozer, Churchill was driving this issue along from that last week of June to that fateful day on the 3rd of July. The lead up to Mers-el-Kebir, or Oran as it's sometimes known, is not quite complicated, but there's a lot going on. You know, the three French are involved. Admiral Darlan, who's Vichy France, has said that we're not going to side with the Germans for these ships, but Darlan was not exactly a trustworthy figure, as history shows, after the fall of France. And if my memory serves, he was assassinated in 1943-44. And Hitler undeniably would have wanted these ships. The Bismarck, I believe, was commissioned by this point. The Tirpitz was still being built, if not doing sea trials. The surface fleet had taken a bit of a pounding at Norway. They lost a battle cruiser, or at least a pocket battleship. They had one damaged after the Globe rammed her. They've already lost the Grass Bay in 1939. And Hitler didn't really seem to understand the war at sea anyway. I think he told Admiral Rader at some point early in the war, on land I'm a hero, but at sea I'm a coward, and he was usually seasick. There's not many photos I've seen of Hitler on water, put it that way. But these ships, if they had been pressed into German action, could have possibly changed the tide of the war at sea, certainly if they were utilised properly. I mean, the Bismarck episode illustrates, up until she was damaged anyway, that they weren't exactly utilised in the best way, or the Bismarck could have sunk an entire convoy from 23 miles away, partly because of the British action prior, from before losing the hood right through to the end of the chase, of course. She didn't really get a chance to exercise that power, but there were grand visions of the Bismarck and maybe the Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau now and a few other ships sort of forming some kind of killer group, and that would have been bloody potent. All that firepower if used properly. So anyway, you add those French ships to it, with crew that know what they're doing, it would have been an incredible spectre, and you can only imagine, for all the faults in history, Winston Churchill's mind. Let's assume he's gone to bed one night, and I think if memory serves, he went to bed usually quite late and was not prone to having meetings in bed. God help anyone that came if the wind changed. And he's running over what is going on in June 1940, and he sees these French ships. It's an episode that's still, to this day, in the memory of certain people in France, not one that, not a wound that will heal anytime soon, and it's been 80 years. If, when I started university in late September 2005, I can have a girl, a Czech girl, I assume my age, I was 20 back then, when I said something about, we were talking about history, because I think we were both history students, and I mentioned about, I sort of, reading about, I felt sorry for what happened to the Czechs. She blew up at me and had a go at me for a solid 10 minutes about the fact the British didn't do anything in 1938 and effectively were responsible for the Czechs' fate, which in a way we were. not solely, but we had a bloody great hand in it. And she was 20 at the time, and like myself, born 47 years after it happened. So it's a sore wound there, and the shell in the French fleet, definitely a sore wound. It hasn't been brought up when President Macron came over last week for the 80th anniversary of Charles de Gaulle's speech. But I'm sure if you mentioned it to somebody, especially if you're British, it's not going to go down too well. And it is not, for those that know it in this country, a flag waving we've given Johnny Frenchman a bloody nose. No one at top down revelled in what they had done to the French fleet. And certainly not Churchill. Now, there is stuff, of course, that he did and said after 1940. But this was a decision agonised over. His parents had a honeymoon, their honeymoon in Paris. Churchill was awfully keen on the south of France. I think he went there a few times as a child with his parents. He was a keen Francophile. He tried to speak French from what I was seeing, like you see in Darkest Hour. But when you had a voice like Churchill, it sounds like you don't know what you're doing. Me, pardon, monsieur, and all that. I don't think for a moment Churchill was slavering away, going, let's bomb the shit out of the French. We'll never know what was going on in his head, but needless to say, by the start of July 1940, it had gathered pace. Now, the advantage of the Royal Navy in those days is that the Royal Navy still had a sizable presence, of course, in Gibraltar, where Admiral Summerfield's Force H was based. And Oran, if you look at it on a map, is a fairly short hop, really, from Gib. And Summerfield was tasked with sailing out there and possibly doing the deed. I say possibly. There was talks between various parties, British and Vichy French, and it was going back and forth probably with little avail. And so Summerfield sailed, bloody hell, just before the 2nd of July with the ships mentioned earlier, and had some conditions really. And there was a few hours worth, and if I may, I have to use Roy Jenkins' Churchill book, but I'm sure it's somewhere else. They were to offer the French commander 4 choices. 1, continue to fight against the enemy. 2, sail to a British port, where the ships would be interned through the crews, although the crews repatriated to France. 3, sail to a French port in the West Indies, where the ships could be demilitarised and perhaps entrusted to United States care. And 4, scuttle the ships. If none of these choices was accepted, the ships would be bombarded to destruction by the British. Cunningham, old ABC, Andrew B. Cunningham, was also one of the key commanders, not with Force H, and he was become one of our war heroes, naval war heroes, and he has a nice little bust in Trafalgar Square with Jellicoe and Beatty, maybe? I think I should know by now, being a tour guide, but no one ever asked me what they are. No one can see them, I don't think, from the tour bus. But needless to say, he treated his orders with a little bit of flexibility and sort of passed it on to Summerfield, and Summerfield turns up, and as I say, it goes back and forth a little. But nothing's done. The French are not budging. They're not going to do anything, it seems. Dependent on orders from above. Now, at the same time, or at least the night of the attack, French ships in British ports like Plymouth, well, chiefly Plymouth, but also Portsmouth, were being interned by the British, and it went reasonably well, except for the French submarine Suif, where a couple of Royal Navy personnel and a French sailor were killed during a short pitched gun battle. So the French-British alliance was creaking, and it was already fractured down the middle during the Battle of France, and especially during the Dunkirk evacuation. And now the British Allies have taken these ships, which have been in British ports for the better part of 2 or 3 weeks, and now the British fleet is sitting off Mers-el-Kebir. Now today it's 32 degrees Celsius, and I've not yet melted into the ground despite best efforts, and I can only imagine it was a nice warm day in July 1940, not as hot as it is now. I mean, I've never seen it dramatised on TV, and in a way I think something like The Darkest Hour could have done this quietly and with I'm going to say dignity. But again, it's quoted in this book. Churchill sends a signal at the end of the 2nd of July, and it might have been Churchill, but certainly it sounds Churchillian. You are charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that a British admiral has ever been faced with, but we have complete confidence in you and rely on you to carry it out relentlessly. So morning comes, 9 o'clock rolls about. He spends all day signalling even to the French admiral. And then the Admiralty, I think Admiralty Patience had ran Finland at 6:30 p.m. They were instructed to start shelling the French fleet. And they were at least 10 or so miles out, and the shells were racing in a good few hundred miles an hour. I think I read somewhere 2,500 miles an hour from HMS Hood. It was precision. French ships were sinking and capsizing within minutes. There were flames everywhere, shells crashing all around. Operation Catapult was a success, and it's said that British sailors were weeping as they went about, feeding the shells into the guns and firing the guns. And I've read enough books, both fiction and otherwise, about the Royal Navy in the Second World War, like Douglas Weeman and Nicholas Montserrat for sure, that I guarantee, knowing the British character, there must have been one or two men who probably were indifferent, probably were thinking the French were getting what was coming to them for not helping out, probably made some kind of response about dead Frenchmen, but 99.5% or whatever were not celebrating, were not careful, and yet it was a Royal Navy action where ships were sunk. Some ships got out, mostly destroyers and gunboats, and they got attacked by swordfish, old string bags from the Ark Royal. So that put paid to the French action anyway, and depending on the sources, just shy of 1,300 French sailors were killed. Incredible amount, really. And but Oran served a purpose, whether we like it or not. And that's the trouble with history. You can look back on it and go, this is wrong, this is right. And as a historian, as a student even, we were told at uni, you must never use hindsight. You have to be objective. So Oran showed Churchill and the British were prepared to be ruthless to accomplish their survival and stand up to Hitler. Second of all, they removed these ships from ever being Hitler's playthings. And it said to the whole damn world, we're going to do what we have to. We've done what we've had to. We're sorry. But there you go. It's rather pithy way of summarising, but needless to say, if the speeches in Parliament in May and June were Churchill's way of Churchill convincing his party to back him, and then letting the country know what's going to be is in for, letting the public know that Dunkirk is a defeat, but we're going to carry on, and then we'll fight him in the streets and in the hills, and so on and so forth. This was the first action of the war that Britain said, look, we're going to do what we have to. It was brutally hot that day, and that might have been what some sailors used as an excuse for the tears they shed. Cunningham and Summerfield were certainly not celebrating. There was no kind of grim World War II Noel Coward in which we serve kind of, well chaps, good one, we sunk ship today, scratch that up, and no pithy remarks by sailors like you see. I mean, I love in which we serve, but that opening scene where they're sinking Italian ships is jarring, and then the rest of the film seems to settle. You know, people jumping into the water. Coming in the water is lovely. Look at them, it's like they've heard a whistle and all this stuff, and the rest of the film has its moments of cheesiness, but or typical war film, but as I say, the French are still not entirely happy about so many things, and Oran 80 years ago is one of them. Brexit can't be helping. In fact, amongst all of that, French teachers have been teaching, at least initially in the years after the war, that there was a massacre that happened in 1940, and there was a man responsible for it. Winston Spencer Louis Churchill. So, rightly we focus on the Bengal famine, but Churchill had done this. Some, of course, are supposed to look at this as a signal of what would come ahead in 1943. The two situations are vastly different. I won't be going into the Bengal famine in this, but needless to say, there will be those who draw a line between the two and say that he was prepared. Maybe he was. I would never think of Winston Churchill as bloodthirsty. But again, I suppose that's up for another debate. And I don't feel so miserable. Now it says, because my eyesight is poor, that the next day Winston Churchill, on July 4th, which is usually American Independence Day, stood in front of the House of Commons, feeling ashamed of what he had done. For all his faults, the man did at least seem to have some kind of emotional element to him. He was and a conscience about some things. Now, I say that the Royal Navy weren't chewing about it. Old Boris writes that Churchill says at the end of his speech, I leave it also to the nation and to the United States. I leave it to the world and to history, saying about judgment of his actions. Now, I would have thought that after hearing all that, there would be those there. Somebody in that Parliament must have loved France, but there wasn't silence. And I know I'm quoting from, but I guess it's typical Parliament. To his surprise, there was no disapproving silence. On the contrary, they were cheering. They were on their feet and waving their order papers in scenes of jubilation, such as the Commons had not seen for years. His cabinet colleagues were clustering around and clapping him on the back, in what seems to us a bizarre and tasteless response to the deaths of almost 1,300 Frenchmen. Amid the rejoicing sat Churchill, a hunched figure in his black jacket and striped grey trousers, with his chin in his hands and tears flowing down his cheeks. So there you have it, chaps. Parliament clearly don't know how to act themselves. They don't now. They never will do. Though this video is about Mers-el-Kebir, as I used to say on the tour buses until we ground to a physical halt. Parliament's like this now. It was 80 years ago. It was when England berated a monarch and subsequently sentenced him to death. It was when Henry II was told by Parliament in the 13th century, better sort your act out or we'll sort it for you, and left the man shaking. I'm not excusing their actions in 1940, but Parliament for nearly 1,000 years has acted like a bunch of overgrown children. So, but maybe they were celebrating, as perverse as it was, not for the deaths of 1,300 Frenchmen, but for the fact that Britain had done something to try and safeguard its survival. Churchill really didn't want to sink those ships if he could help it, and there's some that say if he had been allowed longer, Summerfield could have accomplished what Cunningham was doing further along the Med at Alexandria, and that is a bloodless acquisition of those ships. But then history is what it is. It goes in all directions. For all we know, the French, after 2 or 3 days of negotiating, Fiji French anyway, could have said up yours and come out guns blazing. And some French ships during the bombardment did actually return fire. Needless to say, it happened and got overlooked very swiftly, because within a week of Mers-el-Kebir, the Battle of Britain commenced, or at least the first phase of it. At the same time, Britain is now preparing for invasion. Steadily with growing momentum, things are clicking into place, like the auxiliary units, the official name of the British resistance, are coming into creation, and there's many other things in the background and all the rest of it. As I think it was General Ismay noted in a quote I saw when doing my research for my dissertation, the British are anxious by and large to do their bit. Had Britain gone under in the summer of 1940 by invasion or by simply being bombed into oblivion somehow, Oran and the sacrifice imposed upon the French would have been for nothing. Did it contribute to the outcome of the Second World War? In a minute way, I would have thought. It's like that I read in James Holland's book about the Dam Busters raid that I read last year, or the year before even, Operation Chastise. And, 617 Squadron suffered incredible losses in some respects at the time. It suffered the worst losses for any bomber squadron in the war, and 50,000 men ultimately lost their lives at Bomber Command. And many German civilians, but also slave labourers from Russia chiefly and elsewhere were killed, thousands probably, in the floods that resulted, and the Germans ultimately rebuilt those dams within a very short time. And James Holland writes, well, what is the common debate to now, and this is the beauty of history, is that you can still sort of look at it, and I don't know about Max Hastings' book, which came out last year, I'm going to have to check out and compare, but was it worth it in the end? Did it accomplish it? Was the loss of the bombers and their crew worth it? Was the loss of all those slave labourers worth the effort? And it's something that I imagine in that part of Germany, Britain still sort of looked upon as mass murderers, like Hamburg and Cologne and Dresden and elsewhere. Did it matter in the end? As far as the dams raid was concerned, it briefly eliminated a source of industry. It wiped out a fair chunk of industry, or at least enough to make a difference. And then the aftermath, the Germans spent money, spent man hours and manpower rebuilding those dams, and then dedicating manpower to defending those dams from what happening again. And that made a little difference to the war effort, but enough, because there's no men fighting in the war, there's no men building things for the war directly. They're rebuilding dams so that they can continue the war effort. So Mers-el-Kebir, as horrific as it was, helped seal the deal overseas. The United States were apparently quite impressed by the ruthlessness of what Britain did. The French obviously liked the goal. Were sort of split. You know, they might have been captured by the Germans or Italians. But those ships not falling into German hands possibly made a minute difference. But again, I know I'm sort of bitter, I'm just trying to think. So it's always a dangerous sign. His name will be dirt in France, as it is in India, as it is in Wales, and elsewhere. But in this instance, Oran, it was a decision, and war is about decisions that do not go down terribly well. I'm not comparing it as such, but you know, Harry S. Truman made a decision to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The main reason being that we didn't want to risk 1 million casualties. And I read recently that the invasion of Japan, overall known as Operation Downfall, would have started around November 1945 and was theorised to carry on until March 1946. And it could have turned out to be something like Vietnam or Iraq. So the justification of destroying hundreds of thousands of Japanese, as opposed to 1 million American, British, Australian, New Zealand, etc. troops. Eisenhower made a decision to go on June 6, 1944. Had he postponed the invasion, the next chance might have been July 1944. But then what if another storm kicked off? Hitler could have then possibly refocused efforts solely in the east, as far as armed forces were, or take a gamble, or continue to use the V1 and V2s, but this time use them with common sense onto the ports. Fatal error in some respect. There's 1,001 decisions during every conflict that have not gone down terribly well, to put it mildly, that are still picked and debated upon by people who are not even alive when they were made. Recent exception, probably, of course, is the General Belgrano in the Falklands War of 1982, the aftermath of the Iraq War, stuff in Korea, I imagine, the First War, the Civil War, Boer War, any war, war. Am I defending Churchill? No. I know it sounds like I am. I'm just saying that in 1940 decisions had to be made, and he made it. So if you have watched to the end of this protracted piece filmed in a rather stuffy council flat somewhere in deepest, darkest Buckinghamshire, thank you. If you are in the mood to do so, feel free to leave a comment. I think I've got it set up that people can. I've been subjected to spam bots lately, and so any comment that isn't a spam bot, I don't look at straight away, or if I do, I'm immediately selecting a spam because I've gotten used to it just being a spam bot, so that's not me censoring people. this video will be out on the 4th of July, so by then I might have done a bunch of quickie videos, as they call them. Not necessarily relating to war. The 70th anniversary of the Korean Wars today, or the starting of it. I don't unfortunately know much about Korea, which makes me feel bad, because it was, as it says in the paper today, it's known as the Forgotten War. And otherwise, until I know different with my job, we've got the Battle of Britain coming up, and a bunch of other things for the summer of 1940. And once my furlough ends, I'm either going to be in paid work or not. And God help us, any of us getting a job in this current climate. I don't have the best luck getting work ever. Fine time to choose to go back to university, eh? Anyway, chaps, with my cheap glass of Mers-el sparkling water, bid you adieu. Thank you again for sitting through this, either watching it or skipping through it, and take care wherever you are.